Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Some of you may or may not know my background, but I was raised in a Hindu family. And while my parents may not have been the most intentional about it, but they still believed in it. And as a child, I was always curious, always questioning, and I was blessed enough to have a childhood friend that invited me to church every week. She invited me to church every Friday for Friday service for 6 years, and I went almost every Friday, and soon it became every Sunday. And about 3 years in, I believe 3 years in, I knew that I believed, but I didn't want to hurt my parents. And at that time, I remember I would go to these Friday services and they'd have altar calls, and I would get so stirred in the spirit now that I think about it, but it would affect me so much, and I would get that inkling, like, I'm going to accept Jesus right now, and I would get scared and run out of the sanctuary. There was actually one day where I ran out, and I knew my friend was going to come after me, so I hid in the bush. Throughout those 6 years, everything was normal, everything was great, and then 2015, I just became super depressed, and if I'm being entirely honest, there was nothing wrong. Nothing was wrong. I'm the type of person who has a 5-year plan and plans everything out, has a Google Calendar, and everything was going to plan, and there was nothing wrong in my life. So I was so confused as to why I was so upset all the time. And I had been around church so often and been around praying people and prayer warriors so often that I picked up a few things in my brain, I guess, and I found myself one night just crying, and the words, "break my heart for what breaks yours," came out of my mouth. And that year, that following month, my life changed a lot. Everything that I had planned probably completely fell apart. And I realized I didn't need it. But the next morning, I called my pastor, who was my pastor later on, but I called her up and I told her how I was feeling, and she told me, come to my house. So I came to her house. This is the same pastor who was pastoring me, knowing I was an unbeliever for 6 years, and treated me like her own daughter for the next 13 years. And I came to her house, and she was talking to me, she was investing in me, and she led me through prayer, and I was saved in her living room in January of 2015. And she left for 2 minutes. She said, "I'll be right back," and she left to her room, and she came back with this Bible. And she told me, "I bought this 6 years ago when the Lord told me I would have an opportunity to give this to you." I'm not going to say the following year wasn't... I'm not going to say the following year was easy, but I've had God's grace in it throughout everything, throughout every minute of it. While I had so many plans, there were plans that needed to be taken down. There were walls that he needed to break. And while at the time, I thought that maybe my world was shaking, I think it was more of prison walls coming down. And I've seen his grace in my parents when even just a few months after I got saved, someone came to me and asked me, "Why don't you go on a missions with us to Peru?" And I thought, yeah, no way. There's no way my Indian parents are going to let me go to all the way across the world to Peru just to share the love of God. And I came home that night, and everyone had told me before I left, just pray about it, pray about it. If it's God's will, he'll make a way. And I prayed about it, but if I'm being honest, it wasn't very wholeheartedly. And I came home, and I was sitting with my mom at the table, and she looks at me and asks me, "Are Priscilla and Trinity going to Peru this year?" And completely confused, I say yes. And she's like, "Why don't you go with them?" Because that's God. And I was excited, and I said, "Yes, of course." And she told me, "Ask your dad." And in my head, I was like, there's no way. Yeah, I got a yes from her, but there's no way I'm going to get a yes from him. And my dad came home that night, and I went to him, and I said, "Papa, can I go to Peru with Trinity and Priscilla this year?" And he looks at me, and he asked me, "Do you want the big suitcase or the small suitcase?" Well, my parents don't believe, they understand, and they've come such a long way, and that's grace if I've seen it. I've had grace in church family. I was so blessed in my prior church that my pastor was like my second mother, and my church family really was my family. And when the transition came to transition from that church to ICA, it was probably one of the hardest decisions of my life. I actually met Natasha, Atkinson, Santosh, and Anderson a few years back, years before I actually came to ICA, coincidentally at a fundraiser for that Peru missions, the third time I went. And I remember the Lord telling me that I was going to come here at some point. And I remember thinking I wasn't ready, and I didn't want to leave that family that I had. And God He gave me so much clarity over the last 2 years. I started coming to ICA last year, and a few months prior to that, I went to New York to help my friend plant their church. And we were praying after service, and a random couple comes up to me, and their son was just some random Indian boy that my friend found on the subway and invited him to church, and he brought his parents with him. And they came to me, and they were so excited, and they're like, we have to tell you something. And the night prior, I was talking to my friend and telling her about ICA, and that I knew that at some point God would tell me to come here, but I didn't know when it would be. And they came to me and they said, we were just at a service in Boston, and there was a man prophesying, and he told us, you're going to meet a girl named Anisha, and when you meet her, tell her it's time. And that day, I went home and I cried, if I'm being honest, because even the best decisions are tough decisions. Even the best changes are tough changes. And I prayed to God that he would give me the easiest transition possible, and he did do that for me. In the following month, I was really involved in ministry, and he made a way for me to smoothly step down from all of it and talk to my pastor. And she wasn't surprised when I told her, and she told me that it was like seeing your youngest daughter go off to college. I just thank the Lord for God's clarity and his grace in every situation throughout my life, especially with my parents, because I get asked a lot, your parents are fine with you going to church? And that's just God's grace alone right there. Just because they love me, they've given me grace, and they continue to stand by me while they don't always agree with my decisions. If there's one thing you take from my testimony, it's to be bold in sharing the gospel, because I am the product of someone's prayers. And love with that motive, be the kind of love that buys a Bible 6 years in advance. And I promise you they'll remember, because I remember almost every single time someone shared the gospel with me. I remember in 2010 when some random man at the beach was sharing the gospel, and he tried to talk to me, and I shrugged him off, and he asked me what my name was, and he told me he'd pray for me that night. To this day, I pray that God lets us cross paths again so he can see what that seed has grown into. A verse that God has been sharing with me is Deuteronomy 24. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies and to give you victory. Something that God has told me again and again throughout this year is that victory is not an outcome, but it's what we're resting on. All God's promises will come to pass. Every promise that he's made me, every promise that he's made you will come to pass in his timing and to glorify him, because we have the greatest victory through him. Glory be to God for everything that he's done in my life and continues to do. His love is easily the greatest gift of not only this last decade, but the greatest gift I'll receive in my life.